Welcome to the Overcommitted podcast, where we talk about our commits, our commitments, and some stuff in between. Hello, everyone. I'm your host, Jonathan Tamsut, joined by my fellow hosts, Brittany Ellich, Erika Egemeyer, and Bethany Janos. If I mispronounce any of those, hopefully I'll get it right next episode. We're all software engineers at GitHub, and we thank you for joining. Today, our topic is imposter syndrome. We're going to talk about imposter syndrome. It's a very common, ailment a lot of software engineers suffer, but it's rarely discussed. So we're going to talk about our feelings and hopefully get in deep. Yeah. So do you guys want to go around and just introduce ourselves and give a little background on who we are, why we're worth listening to? Erika, you want to start?
I'm Erika. I am a software engineer on the authorization team at GitHub. I am a career changer. Software engineering is not my first pursuit in life. So for a long time, I've chalked up my imposter syndrome to that. But I've learned a little bit more about it and know that it is not. There can be many reasons, many causes, and there's also good news, things you can do about it.
Brittany, do you want to?
Sure. Yeah. Hi, I'm Brittany Ellich. I am an engineer at GitHub on the billing team. And I was also a career changer into tech. I've been working in tech for 7 years now, I think. And I did something completely different beforehand. And I think that's probably where my source of imposter syndrome comes from, although it sounds like everybody has it. So maybe it's not unique to that situation. Bethany?
Yeah, my name is Bethany. I am also a software engineer at GitHub. I work on the Copilot API team. And I, in college, majored in biomedical engineering, and then through some happy coincidences, ended up discovering my love of programming, but definitely always felt imposter syndrome at feeling like I belonged in the tech world, like was technical enough to be there. And so it's been quite the journey getting over that fear and those perceptions of what people think of me. So excited to dive in.
My name is Jonathan. People call me John. Yeah, I'm just maybe generally a neurotic and anxious person. So I think, imposter syndrome has definitely been something I've faced. I kind of came into the tech industry after college. I majored in chemistry. So yeah, it wasn't sort of your traditional like computer science to tech path. And yeah, I definitely had a lot of imposter syndrome early in my career and even to this day. So I think I'm just someone who's become a little bit more aware of, those feelings and have tried to sort of grapple with them in a more kind of like honest and open way. So I guess before we begin, we did a little background research, and it turns out imposter syndrome is sort of something that's been studied for a while. In 1978, Pauline, Clance, and Suzanne Imes, apologize if I mispronounce those names, they published a paper, and it's widely regarded to be sort of the first use of the term imposter syndrome. And their basic definition of imposter syndrome was a psychological pattern where individuals doubt their accomplishments and fear being exposed as a fraud. And one thing that was interesting is this paper that they published in 1978, they initially studied high-achieving women. And what was interesting is, a lot of these women described, and I quote, feeling an internal experience of intellectual phoniness, even though they all had some concrete evidence of success and had concrete evidence that they deserved to be there. So kind of other sort of things that came out of this study that I think we all kind of have experience with is, people with imposter syndrome tend to attribute their achievements to external factors like luck or timing or just, mistakes rather than their talent or effort. I think that's something we can all kind of resonate with and live with a persistent fear of being exposed as a fraud. Yeah. So does anyone want to go around and talk about kind of a specific time they felt imposter syndrome and how they dealt with it? I know, in sort of this highly technical field, there's a lot of like intellectual posturing that happens, whether intentional or unintentional. There's a lot of, there's this classic trope, I think we can all relate to where like people are like, yeah, I started programming when I was 11 on my PDP 11 machine. And as you go on Hacker News, you'll see a bunch of those posts. And I think initially you can kind of buy into that and think, wow, I'm so behind. And I know that's something I initially felt. What about you guys?
Yeah, definitely that. And then like a lot of the initial like studies and white papers and sort of like industry history of computer science came from a lot of like mathematicians, academics, a lot of white men. So I think, yeah, there's sort of this like history culture of like a certain stereotypical like software engineer personality or background coming from like a math background. Yeah. Like you said, like having done this since I was 5 years old or like never wanting to leave my basement. Like those are all kinds of things that like I find myself comparing myself to and being like, I'm not that. So am I really a software engineer?
Yeah, one thing I think about a lot is I've heard this before about doctors, how like originally doctors they put a lot of effort into like marketing the term doctors to make it sound like, it didn't used to sound as important as it does now. And I feel like some of that, maybe there's a little bit of that in engineering too, especially software engineering, where sometimes it feels like trying to build more than we necessarily are. Not that we're not building things that are incredibly important, because a lot of the world runs on software now.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I think after recently we read a book called Domain-Driven Design and things like that. And I know starting off, the language was such a big thing and is such a big way of making folks feel welcome and accepted. And so whenever I would read something or encounter something I didn't understand, I immediately would feel like I didn't belong there, or that was not a place for me, or I was dumb. And I think there was, through reading a lot of books and listening to podcasts, I realized, well, that's not necessarily the case. If somebody's saying something that you don't understand, that's kind of a failing of that language or that code or whatnot, that people can't come in and understand it, and not necessarily a failing on your part. I mean, of course, there's some things where you have to like learn languages and have questions about how languages work, but I think in all, it's so important to make sure our language that we're using and day to day is just something that's welcoming for other people and accessible for folks to understand, even if they're new, if they've been in this career for a while, but just making sure it's a friendly place for folks.
Yeah. And I find, this is something I struggle with, but like this idea of like binary thinking, like you're either a software engineer or you're not, but like the reality is like a lot more nuanced and varied, right? People have different expertises. I mean, you could have been programming since you were, 5 years old, but maybe you don't know React, right? Which is like, a tool that, you may need to use in your job. So I think, right, like there's also, I think this idea that like there's a rock star programmer who knows everything is, you could poke a lot of holes in there. I mean, at the end of the day, we're building tools for people to make, hopefully improve their lives. And your pure technical acumen is not the only useful thing, right? Your ability to like empathize with a user, your ability to like work with others, your knowledge of the domain, your, how much you care to make a product like accessible and available to, but so there's like all these things that that really matter. And I think certainly early in my career, I kind of glorified these like geniuses who like, knew the Linux kernel back to front. And I think as I've just grown, there's a bunch of different types of programmers that are useful and good in their own ways. And this idea that, some people are real software engineers and others aren't is just kind of a silly sort of dichotomy that doesn't really exist.
Yeah, for sure. I think the software engineering industry as a whole, there's been a lot of talk about 10x developers or the developers who are just, rock stars and really good at what they do. But I've found so much more satisfaction within my own career. I mean, those people are really great to learn from. But when I'm on a team that is able to accomplish a lot of things, that's just so much more valuable, I feel like, than, relying on a single person. If a single person leaves, then that company is, that is a load-bearing person that everything will crumble around. Whereas if you have a team that everybody is capable of doing those things, then I find that a lot more beneficial to work with too.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's also important to like identify for yourself like what your measures of success are. And this is kind of like moving ahead to like how do you combat imposter syndrome? And like I think one thing that always eats away at me is like am I doing a good job? And like being able to measure that for myself and then also to like communicate to others is really important. because, you know, it's like I can put a lot of like pull requests together. I can do a lot of work, but like, am I doing the right work? Like, am I developing things that people will actually use? Like, am I developing things that won't break? And yeah, and also like, am I being a supportive teammate? Am I like building relationships with people? So yeah. But like to sort of like draw this to like software engineering as a whole, like I've always been a little bit surprised that there's no like there are certifications and stuff like that in software engineering, but like it's not like we have to like pass a bar or like, you know, get some kind of like, you can come at software engineering from like any background. And so like as an industry, we've kind of come up with these like random like generic success metrics, one of which is like, you know, seemingly this like cultural icon of like, you know, the basement programmer who like never takes, you know, your eyes off a screen or something like that. So yeah, like really distancing myself from that and being like, no, that's not like I'm rejecting that as, you know, what I see as valuable or like good.
Yeah. And I think another thing I've struggled with is like, and kind of related to what you said, Erika, like disentangling my self-worth, like even as just like an intelligent, competent person from like achieving goals at work. Like I think there have been so many times I've just have had really harsh negative thoughts about myself because I wrote a bug or, you know, took longer than I wanted to on an issue. And I think, right, like, yeah, they're like, I think I'm still like grappling with this. Like, how do I hold a high bar for myself, but also like, you know, still feel like I have worth when I don't, you know, sort of achieve what I want or when I make a mistake or, and I think, right, like in a competitive environment, you know, I think software engineering, you know, I think it's certain environments can feel competitive, right? You're kind of incentivized to like appear knowledgeable. I mean, right, you know, no one, you know, I think there's kind of this idea like no one wants to show up to work and be like, I actually don't know what I'm doing. And it's like, you know, I think the reality is like to an extent we all don't know what we're doing. And I think it's important to like create a culture where like people are okay talking about what they don't know and talking about their weaknesses and don't feel like they're going to be penalized for like needing help.
Totally agree. And I think that was one thing that pivoted in my brain when I was really struggling with imposter syndrome at the beginning of my career is kind of accepting that my job as a software engineer isn't to know everything, but it's to be able to figure it out and get that help, get that, like read those resources and stuff. And I think once I took the pressure off of myself for being perfect or just being knowledgeable on everything and was okay saying, you know, I don't know, but I'm going to figure it out and accepting that that's an acceptable thing to say, it really changed a lot of my perception on my work and my abilities.
That's a really good point. I think that's the biggest change between when I was just starting out and now is like, I know that if I bang my head against a problem for long enough, I will eventually solve it, whether that's by getting more help from somebody or anything. Maybe that's misguided confidence, but I know that I'll eventually figure it out. And I think that is really helpful for overcoming that. Can't say that I don't feel imposter syndrome anymore, but it's helpful.
Yeah, no, totally. I feel the same way. It's like, you know, through ChatGPT, my friends, internet, I'll be able to figure stuff out. You know, I feel like I have a good enough mental model of most things to be able to like know what the right questions to ask are. Yeah.
I'm curious, Jonathan, did you happen to see any like more recent studies of like imposter syndrome? Like, I'm kind of curious, like what we know now versus like what we first knew from like a psychology perspective.
Yeah. So I actually used I think ChatGPT Deep Research to look for studies. There have been more recent studies. I did find it was funny. One, you know, I think I mentioned this to you before, but one study was like, you know, and imposter syndrome is also found in men, which I thought was funny. I don't recall exactly what these newer studies, but yeah, that would be interesting to like double click into. I mean, yeah, I mean, especially with how the software engineering has evolved, I think it's become, you know, more diverse, certainly than it was, you know. But yeah, it's I wonder what sort of these like changing dynamics, more diversity. There's been, you know, I feel like a lot of tech companies have had, a lot of tech companies have, you know, pretty unforgiving culture, but it also seems like generally there's been a shift to like, you know, be a little more thoughtful about how people interact and unconscious biases and stuff like that. Yeah, good question.
I think it's probably something that would be really hard to measure too, right? Because I mean, my own level of imposter syndrome goes up and down during the day depending on what I'm working on and if I've recently fixed something. So it's probably like company culture, which is just really difficult to measure, I would think.
Yeah, it is sad, or it's funny / sad how much like my own self-worth is a function of just like, did I just figure something out? It feels so good to figure something out, no matter how trivial, but it feels not fun when you're like, man, I should be able to, do this.
I know we all took that quiz, which I thought was kind of insightful, and also like more evidence for this this idea that like imposter syndrome is like mostly something that affects women, because I found a quiz on like, I don't know, womenscareerdaily.com or something like that, and it was like a quiz of like different types of imposter syndrome, and I feel like that helped me kind of look at it. Maybe like I said, I used to attribute my imposter syndrome to being a career changer, and I kept thinking like, oh, if I had only started when I was 5, I wouldn't be feeling this way. But like this quiz kind of had you self-evaluate on a bunch of different situations of like how you respond. And I think my persona type came back as like someone who's always seeking more knowledge. Like I never feel like I know enough. I was like, actually, I think that that's true. And like I have felt this my entire life, not only in software engineering. Like I've felt this in everything that I've tried to do. Like I'm always chasing that next level of expertise.
Yeah. And just to speak to that quiz, we'll share it in the show notes, but I think it was our 5 kinds of imposter syndrome. Which one is yours? Yeah, I took that and I got the Superwoman, which again, I think it's on everywoman.com. I'm sure that it applies to everybody equally. So the Superwoman is most likely to show up through a preoccupation with the need to take on multiple roles and excel in all of them, which definitely resonates with me. I think when I feel like I'm not doing well, then I just do more things and see if that fixes it. And it never does, but it makes me feel like I'm doing something. So
yeah. This I think this quiz was intended for women, but I took it and I got a perfectionist, which I don't know if I fully resonate with that. I know Bethany, you also got perfectionist. I feel like you're not to throw you under the bus, I feel like you're maybe more of a perfectionist than I am. But
You're a perfectionist at being a perfectionist.
Yeah.
No, I think I did resonate with that. And actually, it was very funny. I saw it was the most common one, and I was like, wait, I want to be an uncommon one. I want to be the perfect kind of imposter.
That's funny.
That was my first thought, but no, it is absolutely true. A lot of times I struggle with that activation energy of doing things just because I know I want to make it as perfect as possible. So sometimes I struggle just so hard with starting because I put so much on what I'm doing that it's difficult.
I find it kind of hilarious that John has imposter syndrome about his imposter syndrome.
And it's I think like one thing that interests me about this, and this is like we all have different backgrounds, different childhoods and stuff, and it's like I've spent a lot of time in the last couple of years like unpacking how like my childhood, my relationship with my parents, etc., kind of like shapes my attitudes and feelings towards work, and it's like I think for me, kind of like this desire to be special, or this like, and I think like working remote, sort of exacerbates that. Like this desire to like kind of be seen as special in the eyes of others kind of is related and adds to this. And I think one thing I've really struggled with is like, like I want to be seen as exceptional, and how do you sort of go about your day and not let that sort of kind of guide everything you're doing and just not make you sort of extra competitive. So I think these are I feel like these are things I've like dealt with more recently in my career, is like kind of these like maybe deeper core like little T traumas. But I think it does kind of tie into imposter syndrome, because a lot of it is about like managing perceptions of others. And I think at some point just realizing that like most people aren't judging you as harshly as you're judging yourself, and a lot of these like drives are just like totally internal. Was it kind of an important realization for me.
I completely resonate with like all of that. Like the thriving on praise, I totally do that. For those who aren't internal to GitHub, we have a system called Sparkles where you can sparkle people for doing stuff. It's like kudos to so-and-so for helping out with this. And I gamified that from the first minute here. I'm like, I'm going to get the most sparkles. I'm afraid to say I have not gotten the most sparkles, but it's sometimes definitely sparkle driven development for me. John, I think that was such a good point on how your childhood, how your life has influenced you and these things. And I think I certainly have talked about this so often in therapy, where I will come and she's like, how's your mood? And I'm like, I feel horrible because this person thinks I'm dumb. And she's like, well, why do you think they think you're dumb? And you have to explain it that it's like, oh, okay, they probably don't think I'm dumb, but I feel dumb for having to say this or ask this or be wrong about this. And I think going to therapy has been so helpful for just understanding those, when I'm mind reading or when I'm assuming I know what people are thinking about me, and it's really not in my hands. It's not something I know. I can't mind read. I think it is so intertwined with your mental health and your mental well-being, and it's so important to keep check on that as a whole to influence your happiness in your career and make sure you can mitigate those occurrences of imposter syndrome even better.
Yeah. And, we work in this hierarchy of people, and, people think engineering is this objective field where we're all just, there's right answers to everything. But we all know that's not true. And there's sort of this dynamic where people's personalities collide. And so, yeah, we've all worked with people who are just really difficult to work with. And it's well, they're probably compensating for something or insecure, et cetera. And I really, you wonder, if everyone at the company, had to attend therapy or people were more open about their emotions, what would that lead to?
I think if everybody in the world attended therapy, that would be a good starting point for sure for a lot of things. I think one thing that I realized is when I entered my 30s, I feel I don't know if it's just brain development or what, but I feel I have so much better ability to step out and see things from a broader perspective now than I ever had growing up. And I think a lot of that is as a teenager and in your 20s and stuff, you're so focused on yourself that it's blinding to everything else. And I feel as I've gotten older, I've just gotten so much more perspective on things. And I'm oh, nobody's paying attention to what I'm doing. Nobody has any idea what I'm doing because I have no idea what everybody else is doing because, and I think that has been really helpful too. And unfortunately, I feel that's something you just get with time or maybe with mental health, taking care of that. Maybe it's
yeah, I mean, definitely not everyone can attend therapy. It's some people it's cost prohibitive, it is expensive, but yeah, I mean, being able to share out what we've learned and help others develop that mental toolbox. And I've definitely found great success with the approach of when a negative thought enters my mind, inspecting it, stopping, taking a breath, inspecting it, asking myself, where is this coming from? Is this true? Yeah. And if so, why? If not, I can forget it. I can leave it at the door and not worry about it anymore. And yeah. And also kind of that toolbox of okay, are there patterns that feed into, what makes me feel this way? And yeah, I mean, for me, it's always thinking that I'm not going to know something and thinking that oh, if I don't know something, everyone thinks I'm dumb. And learning how to track my own knowledge for myself and proving to myself that, no, I do know these things. Or if I don't, then this is how I can find it out. And I've learned a ton from all of you of toolboxes, mental modeling, mental mapping and stuff like that. So yeah, I've been very lucky to learn from you all on how to track my knowledge too. But yeah, I mean, the point of why even get rid of imposter syndrome, in my mind, it's not to become a better worker bee. It's because it reduces my mental toil. When I come to work every day, because I'm, unless I quit my job, I'm going to keep coming to work and yeah, am I going to be happy throughout my day, or am I going to be like upset and like sad? And I feel like this is one of those things where like when you kind of learn how to deal with it a little bit better, your mental toil, like at least like the emotional side of work is a little bit lighter, because you're not so worried about like, am I a fraud?
Yeah. And I think like, hopefully there's like one aspect of or more of this job we all like, whether it's the social. And I think for me, like one thing that's helped me is like, I like solving puzzles. I like problems. And so focusing on that and being less like evaluative of myself and just like kind of immersing myself in the enjoyment of like, hey, I actually like this job. And there is like inherently struggle because we're solving problems that are like unknown. And so I think that's helped. I also think, it's funny, like, kind of taking a step back. I for me at least, like having emotions, or like not having emotions, we all have emotions, but like acknowledging my emotions and being sort of like consciously aware of them is like actually a relatively new phenomenon to me. I think like growing up, it was, having emotions were bad. It was like, oh, why are you sad? Or like, stop being so emotional. And I think just like the simple realization that like every human being is guided by emotions, access your conscious emotions. I also sort of believe in the subconscious and sort of that background processing, which is less accessible, but like you can at least access your conscious emotions and like, kind of reason through them and understand them, which I think is helpful.
To that point, I actually discovered a app recently called How We Feel. I'm not sure if any of you have heard of this, but it is actually one of the most beautiful apps I've seen ever. It's just gorgeous and so intuitive, but I've only done it for a couple of days now, but it's really nice it notifies you and you're like, okay, I'm going to pause and try to name what I'm feeling right now. And there's like, it starts with 4 categories and then they can go like more broad from there. And I think it's really cool to just like pause, be like, okay, what am I feeling right now? What is happening? What's going on? And go from there. But anyways, it was a great app. Figure since we're talking tech, it's just a good example of good technology. It doesn't make you sign in or anything, which is really cool.
Amazing.
Right?
That's the best part.
Yes.
Nice. Yeah, I think if I were to boil down like what has really fixed my imposter syndrome too, I think sort of like John was saying is like accepting that there are things that I'm good at and reminding myself, like, I know that I'm good at these things and trying to focus on those when I realize like there are things that I'm just not good at. And I also accept that there are things that I'm not good at and there are things that I don't really care to get better at. I would rather go to somebody who's an expert in this thing than actually learn it myself. And I feel like that's actually pretty valuable than compared to, trying to get through a book that I don't care about or try to force myself to learn more things because it's impossible to learn everything. So I think accepting sort of what I'm good at and what I'm not good at has been really helpful.
I also think one other thing I think I've seen like all of us do this, not to keep, but like kind of downplaying your accomplishments, right? Like you do something, you're like, oh, that was easy, but it wasn't. Like you spent a lot of time developing skill, context on the problem and solving it. And I do this so much where I'm like, yeah, but this thing I did, that was easy. It's not that impressive. And I think that's something I still do to this day and probably should do less of.
Yeah, you don't see all of the work that was underlying to build up to that skill. It's like, I think I see this often when people are complaining about, very how much people charge for like being a photographer or something like that. And it's like, well, you don't see all of the work that they put in to get to this point. Yeah, they might only be spending an hour with you and a few hours editing afterwards, but all of the work that they put in to learn this skill is also really important. And that's also what you're,
I also kind of one note I had in the research or in the prep for this was, we live in, I think the technology field is like, there's a lot of hype and new technology. And there is kind of this pressure I felt to like spend extra hours, like learning weekends, And I think that kind of ties into like the sort of the competitive nature of all of this. And like, yeah, there are times where I've, really felt like I needed to kind of work on the weekends to learn a new technology. I think, sure, like that's helped and that's been nice. And there've been times I've done that and I've enjoyed it. But I think now I definitely value like work-life balance. And, I think there's sort of like limited utility to that. I also just like, I need rest. Like I'm so much more productive when I've, had a kind of, gotten away from the work. Okay, well, that was a great conversation on imposter syndrome. Appreciate you all for sharing. Thanks for tuning in to Overcommitted. We hope today's episode provided some insight into imposter syndrome and reminded you that you're not alone in these feelings. For more discussions on the real world experiences of software engineers, make sure to subscribe to our podcast, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Jonathan Tamsut, and along with Brittany, Erika, and Bethany, we're signing off. Keep committed and see you next time. Bye-bye.